Mrs. Lillian was no ordinary woman. She owned one of the largest companies in the city, built by her and her late husband from the ground up. After his death, she took over everything, making sure the business continued to grow. People often said that she was sharp, smart, and always 3 steps ahead of everyone in the business world. But what no one knew was that since her husband passed away, she had felt very lonely. The big house she lived in felt empty, and even with all her success, something was missing. At the company, people admired her, but she never allowed anyone to get close. She didn't have many friends, and no one knew much about her personal life. She kept her feelings hidden, even though she often thought about her husband and the promises they had made to each other. One person who had worked at the company for a long time but was almost invisible to everyone was Tom, the janitor. Tom had been at the company for years, but he was quiet and stayed out of the way. He always wore an old, worn-out cap, and his clothes were usually dusty from cleaning all day. People often walked past him without even noticing he was there. But Tom didn't mind. He loved his simple job and never complained. He was always friendly and smiled when someone said hello. In his own quiet way, Tom watched everything that went on in the office. He saw how people hurried from meeting to meeting, talking about things he didn't understand. He liked that no one paid much attention to him, allowing him to quietly do his work without any fuss. One late afternoon, just as Tom was finishing up his work for the day, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Lillian, the powerful and mysterious owner of the company, walked up to him. He had never spoken to her directly before, and for a moment, he wondered if he had done something wrong. "Tom," she said softly, her voice calm but serious. "I'd like to ask you a favor." Tom blinked, confused. Why would Mrs. Lillian, of all people, want to talk to him? "Of course, ma'am," he said quickly, pulling off his cap out of respect. "What do you need?" Mrs. Lillian looked at him thoughtfully, as if she were trying to make a difficult decision. Her eyes, usually so sharp and focused, seemed softer now, as though she was about to share something important. Tom stood still, his heart beating a little faster. He didn't know what was coming, but it felt important. "There's a big business meeting tomorrow," she began slowly, "and I'd like you to attend it with me." Tom was completely stunned. His mouth dropped open, and he wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly. He quickly put his cap back on, scratching his head in confusion. "Me? But Mom, I'm just the janitor," he said, shaking his head. "I don't know anything about business meetings. I clean the floors and empty the trash bins. Why would you need me?" Mrs. Lillian smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile people gave when they were trying to be polite. It was more of a secret smile, like she knew something that no one else did. "That's exactly why I need you," she replied. "You've been here for years, and I've noticed how carefully you watch things. You might not know this, but I trust you, Tom. I've seen the way you work, the way you carry yourself, and the way you listen. And most importantly, I know you're honest." Tom was still trying to wrap his head around what she was saying. Him. Honest. Sure, he was honest, but that didn't mean he belonged in some big business meeting with powerful people. He imagined all the fancy people in suits talking about numbers and deals he didn't understand. He'd stick out like a sore thumb. "Ma'am, I really don't think I'm the right person for this. I don't even own a suit," Tom said nervously. Mrs. Lillian's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Don't worry about that. I'm not asking you to talk about numbers or wear a fancy suit. I need someone there who can see things clearly, someone who won't be fooled by all the business talk, and I believe that person is you." Tom stared at her for a long moment, trying to figure out if she was serious. He had always thought of himself as just the janitor, the guy who cleaned up after everyone else. But here was Mrs. Lillian, the most powerful person in the company, telling him that she needed him. Someone who had never done anything like this before. A part of him wanted to say no, to walk away and pretend this conversation had never happened. But another part of him, a smaller voice deep inside, told him that maybe, just maybe, this was something special. He had never been asked to do anything like this before. What if she was right? What if he could help her? Finally, after what felt like a long silence, Tom nodded slowly. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." Mrs. Lillian smiled again, this time with relief. "Thank you, Tom. I promise you, you won't regret it." As she turned and walked away, Tom stood there, still trying to process what had just happened. Tomorrow, he was going to walk into a high-stakes business meeting with one of the most powerful women in the city, and he had no idea what was going to happen. The next morning, Tom woke up feeling nervous. His mind was still spinning from Mrs. Lillian's request. He had spent years cleaning the office, quietly going about his work without anyone noticing, and now he was about to walk into a high-stakes business meeting with the owner of the entire company. It felt like a dream. No, more like a strange nightmare. He didn't own any fancy clothes, just his usual work uniform, and an old button-down shirt he hadn't worn in years. Standing in front of the mirror, he sighed. "Well, I'll just have to do the best I can," he muttered to himself. With his worn-out cap firmly on his head, he headed out the door. When he arrived at the company's fancy office building, Tom felt out of place immediately. Everything sparkled. The floors, the walls, even the light fixtures seemed to shine like gold. He walked down the hallway to the big meeting room Mrs. Lillian had told him about. The people in suits, hurrying by with briefcases and important papers, stared at him as he passed. Tom could feel their eyes on him, whispering to one another. "What's a janitor doing here?" he imagined them saying. He kept his head down, feeling more and more unsure with each step. Finally, Tom reached the large wooden doors of the meeting room. His hands were sweaty, and he hesitated for a moment before pushing them open. As he stepped inside, the room went silent for a brief second. There were big windows with a view of the entire city, shiny polished tables, and expensive leather chairs. Everything screamed wealth and power. Tom swallowed hard. Sitting at the table was Mrs. Lillian, looking calm and composed as always, her sharp eyes watching everyone closely. Across from her was a man Tom had never seen before, but had heard whispers about, Mr. Blackstone. He was tall, with slicked back hair, a dark suit, and a confident, almost cocky smirk on his face. Sitting beside him was his assistant, a cold, stern-looking woman who scribbled notes and occasionally whispered into his ear. Tom shuffled awkwardly behind Mrs. Lillian, unsure of where to stand or sit. Mr. Blackstone glanced at him for a brief second, then looked away, not even acknowledging him with a nod. To Mr. Blackstone, Tom was invisible, just a janitor in the wrong place. But Tom noticed Mrs. Lillian glance at him and give him a small, reassuring smile. The meeting began, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Blackstone wasted no time, diving straight into the business talk. He spoke with big, clever words that made Tom's head spin. Revenue projections, market shares, mergers, and acquisitions were tossed around like candy at a parade. Tom had no idea what most of it meant, but he listened carefully. Something about the way Mr. Blackstone was talking didn't feel right. Mrs. Lillian remained calm, asking questions but never showing any emotion. Tom could see that she wasn't fooled by Mr. Blackstone's smooth talking. She wasn't just a successful businesswoman. She was sharp and always thinking ahead. But even so, Mr. Blackstone kept pushing, using more complicated terms and trying to make Mrs. Lillian look like she didn't understand what was happening. Tom couldn't shake the uneasy feeling building up inside him. He wasn't a businessman, but he knew when something didn't feel right. As Mr. Blackstone continued, Tom's eyes wandered around the table, taking in every little detail. That's when he noticed it. Just under the edge of Mr. Blackstone's sleek black briefcase, a piece of paper was peeking out. It wasn't part of the stack of papers being discussed. It was hidden. Tom's heart began to race. The document was barely visible, but there was something about the way it was placed, almost as if Mr. Blackstone didn't want anyone to see it. What could it be? Tom's mind raced. Could it be important? Or was he just imagining things? As the meeting dragged on, Tom found it harder and harder to stay quiet. His instincts were telling him that the hidden paper was important, but he wasn't sure if he should say anything. What if he was wrong? What if it was just some unimportant document, and he made a fool of himself in front of everyone? He could feel the sweat on his palms, and his heart thumped louder with every passing second. Meanwhile, Mr. Blackstone leaned back in his chair, looking more confident than ever. He was pushing Mrs. Lillian to sign a deal, one that he promised would benefit both sides greatly. But Tom could see through the flashy words. This deal wasn't meant to help Mrs. Lillian. Mr. Blackstone had a sly grin on his face, and his assistant nodded along, both of them acting as if they had already won. As she turned, Mr. Blackstone leaned back in his chair, looking more confident than ever. He was pushing Mrs. Lillian to sign a deal, one that he promised would benefit both sides greatly. But Tom could see through the flashy words. This deal wasn't meant to help Mrs. Lillian. Mr. Blackstone had a sly grin on his face, and his assistant nodded along, both of them acting as if they had already won. Suddenly, Tom's eyes shot back to the hidden paper. His pulse quickened, and before he could stop himself, he took a deep breath and spoke up. Excuse me, Tom said, his voice shaky and uncertain. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. Mr. Blackstone's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly annoyed that the janitor had interrupted. Mrs. Lillian, however, looked at Tom with calm curiosity. There's something there under the briefcase, Tom pointed nervously. I think there's a paper under there that you might want to see. For a moment, no one moved. The room was completely silent, and Tom's heart felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. Mr. Blackstone's smirk vanished, replaced by a tense, cold stare. He glanced down at the briefcase, and his hand quickly shifted to cover the paper. But it was too late. Mrs. Lillian's sharp eyes had already locked onto the hidden document. Move the briefcase, Blackstone, she said calmly, her voice full of authority. Mr. Blackstone hesitated, but slowly he slid the briefcase to the side, revealing the document underneath. Mrs. Lillian reached out and picked it up, her eyes scanning the page quickly. The room was thick with tension as she read the document. Tom's breath caught in his throat as Mrs. Lillian's expression changed. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, and for a brief moment, Tom thought he saw something like anger flicker across her face. Mr. Blackstone shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Lillian looked up, meeting Mr. Blackstone's eyes. You were trying to cheat me, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Tom's heart pounded as the realization hit him. He had just uncovered something big, something that Mr. Blackstone had tried to hide. And now, everything was about to change. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as Mrs. Lillian calmly held the hidden document in her hands. The room seemed to freeze in time. No one dared to speak as her eyes moved back and forth over the words written on the paper. The quiet tension in the room felt like it was about to explode. Tom shifted nervously, unsure of what was going to happen next. His mind raced with doubt. Maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe this paper wasn't as important as he thought. He could feel Mr. Blackstone's icy stare burning into him, but he didn't look up. What if this decision to speak up had made things worse? Mr. Blackstone, who had been calm and confident just moments ago, was now visibly uncomfortable. His assistant nervously shuffled her papers, trying to avoid eye contact with everyone in the room. Mr. Blackstone cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, trying to regain control of the situation. Mrs. Lillian, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, he said smoothly, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. That document is probably just an old file or a draft. Nothing important. We don't need to get distracted by small details. Let's continue with the deal. But Mrs. Lillian didn't respond right away. She remained quiet, her eyes still scanning the document. Tom could see that something had changed in her expression. There was a flicker of anger, but also a steely determination. Tom swallowed hard. Had he done the right thing? Or had he made a terrible mistake? Just as the silence became unbearable, Mrs. Lillian gently set the paper down on the table. She looked up, her gaze steady and calm, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes. "Mr. Blackstone," she said quietly, her voice firm, "this is not a misunderstanding." The room seemed to grow even colder as her words hung in the air. Tom held his breath. "This document," Mrs. Lillian continued, "is not an old file or a draft. It's a hidden agreement you intended to slip past me, one that would have handed over control of my company's most valuable assets to you." Tom's heart raced as he heard the words. So, he had been right. The paper under the briefcase was crucial, and it had saved Mrs. Lillian from a disastrous deal. Mr. Blackstone's face turned pale. He fumbled with the papers in front of him, trying to gather his thoughts. His assistant looked down at her notepad, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The smooth, confident businessman who had entered the room minutes ago was now stumbling over his words. Mrs. Lillian shook her head. "You did exactly what was needed, and for that, I am forever grateful." There was a long, quiet pause as Tom absorbed everything she had told him. He thought back to all the times Mr. Lillian had stopped to chat with him, how he had always been kind and friendly, even when Tom was just mopping floors. Those moments had meant something. They had shaped the trust Mrs. Lillian now had in him. Finally, Tom managed to speak again. "Your husband, he was a good man," he said softly. "I didn't know him well, but I could tell. He always treated me with respect. I never thought I'd be helping him, even after he was gone." Mrs. Lillian smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He believed in you, Tom, and today you showed me why." Tom smiled through his own tears, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of pride and belonging. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, someone who had been trusted and respected. And for the first time in his life, Tom truly believed in himself. As Mrs. Lillian rose from her seat and extended her hand, Tom stood up and shook it firmly, knowing that this moment had changed everything. They were no longer just the businesswoman and the janitor. They were a team. Before we begin this story, make sure you've watched part 1 of Tom's journey. I will leave the video in the description box. In the first part, we were introduced to Tom, a humble janitor who had worked for years at Mrs. Lillian's company, largely unnoticed by the bustling corporate world around him. However, everything changed when Mrs. Lillian, the company's owner, recognized Tom's integrity and sharp observational skills. During a critical business meeting, Tom discovered a hidden document that exposed a deceitful plot to take advantage of the company. Thanks to his bravery and honesty, Mrs. Lillian was able to stop the deal and protect her company. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from viewers around the world. Now let's see how Tom navigates this new chapter of his life, as his quiet dedication and integrity are celebrated in ways he never could have imagined. Let's begin. Tom stood awkwardly at the window, looking out at the city skyline. The events of the previous day still echoed in his mind. He couldn't believe what had happened. He, a janitor, had exposed a hidden document that could have ruined the company. It had been a whirlwind, and now here he was, standing in Mrs. Lillian's private office, unsure of what would come next. The door creaked open behind him, and Mrs. Lillian walked in, her presence as calm and commanding as ever. She smiled warmly at Tom as she took a seat behind her desk, motioning for him to join her. "Tom," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I want to thank you again for what you did yesterday. You didn't just save the company. You reminded me why I trust my instincts, and why I trust people like you." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still not sure what to say. He had never been good at taking compliments, especially from someone as important as Mrs. Lillian. "I didn't do much," he muttered, his eyes darting to the floor. "I just saw what was in front of me." Mrs. Lillian leaned forward, her gaze intent but kind. "That's exactly why I asked you to come today, Tom. You see things clearly. In a world where most people are clouded by ambition, greed, or pride, you remain honest. You see things for what they are, not for what you want them to be." Tom's heart thudded in his chest. He had never thought of himself that way. He was just a man who did his job, and tried to do it well. The idea that someone like Mrs. Lillian valued him for it felt overwhelming. "I want to offer you something, Tom," she said, breaking the silence. "A promotion." Tom blinked. A promotion. The word hung in the air, almost surreal. It wasn't that he hadn't imagined something like this, but it always seemed too far-fetched. He was the janitor, the guy who swept the floors and emptied the trash bins. What kind of promotion could she possibly be talking about? He cleared his throat. "A promotion, ma'am. I don't know anything about business or running a company." Mrs. Lillian smiled, as if she had anticipated his response. "That's the beauty of it, Tom. I'm not offering you a traditional corporate role. I'm creating a new position for you, something that fits your unique strengths." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "You see, this company needs more than just business knowledge and fancy degrees. It needs honesty, integrity, and a fresh perspective. And that's exactly what you bring. I want to make you the company's integrity officer, or a special advisor. Your role would be to observe, just like you've always done, and make sure that what happens in this company is fair, transparent, and true." Tom's head swam with confusion. An integrity officer, special advisor. He had never heard of such a position, and how could someone like him, who had spent his life cleaning floors, possibly fit into a job like that? He swallowed hard and shook his head. "I don't know if I can do that, ma'am. I mean, I've always been a janitor. It's what I know. This new role, it's too much. I wouldn't know where to start." Mrs. Lillian leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful but patient. "I understand your hesitation, Tom, but this position wasn't created for someone with a business background. It was created for you because of who you are. You've been in this company for years, quietly observing everything that goes on. You see what most people miss. And more importantly, you're not afraid to speak up when something doesn't feel right. That's a rare quality, and it's exactly what this company needs." Tom fidgeted with the brim of his worn-out cap, his mind racing. The idea of taking on a role so different from anything he had ever known felt overwhelming. He had spent his whole life in the background, happy to keep his head down and do his job. This new position would thrust him into the spotlight, and that terrified him. "I don't think I'm the right person for this," he said quietly, his voice heavy with doubt. "What if I mess up? What if I can't live up to what you're asking of me?" Mrs. Lillian's eyes softened, and she gave him a reassuring smile. "Tom, the fact that you're worried about doing a good job is exactly why you will succeed. You're not driven by ego or ambition. You care about doing the right thing. That's what makes you the perfect person for this role." She leaned forward, her tone growing even more sincere. "You don't have to change who you are, Tom. In fact, I want you to stay exactly as you are, humble, observant, and honest. That's why I'm offering this to you. I trust you." Tom sat in silence for a long moment, turning her words over in his mind. Could he really step into such a role? Could he leave behind the simple life he had always known? It felt like stepping into an entirely new world, one where the stakes were higher, but so were the rewards. He finally looked up at Mrs. Lillian, who was watching him with patience and understanding. "If you really think I can do it," he said slowly, "then I'll give it a try." Mrs. Lillian's smile widened, and she extended her hand. "That's all I ask, Tom. Just be yourself, and I know you'll make a difference." Tom reached out and shook her hand, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty swirling inside him. This was the start of something new, something bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And though he didn't know what the future held, for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he deserved this chance. As he left Mrs. Lillian's office, his heart still racing, Tom couldn't help but think about how much his life was about to change. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. This was a reward not just for what he had done, but for who he was. Tom stood in the doorway of his small, modest home, gazing around with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The house hadn't changed in the many years he had lived there. At least, not until now. It had always been simple, just like him. A single story with a small front porch, peeling paint, and a roof that sometimes leaked when it rained too hard. But for as long as Tom could remember, it had been enough. He had never wanted more. Yet here he was, just a few weeks after his unexpected promotion, and everything seemed different. The raise Mrs. Lillian had given him, along with the substantial financial bonus, had opened doors Tom had never even considered. Suddenly, his life wasn't just about scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, and hoping nothing would go wrong. He had the means to make changes, real changes. The first thing he did was fix up the house. The roof that had leaked for years, repaired. The creaky floorboards, replaced with new, polished wood that gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the old, faded paint on the outside, freshly redone in a soft, welcoming shade of blue. As he walked through the house, admiring the repairs, he felt a deep sense of contentment. But it wasn't just the material improvements that made him feel this way. It was something deeper, something that tugged at his heart. For the first time in his life, he felt secure. Not just physically or financially, but emotionally too. He no longer had to worry about what would happen if something broke, or if an unexpected expense came up. He had earned his place, and with it came the freedom to enjoy life a little more. Still, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this newfound wealth wasn't just for him. He had always believed in living simply, and even though his bank account had grown significantly, his needs hadn't changed much. What would he do with all this money? The thought weighed on him for days, until one morning, while sitting on his newly restored porch, sipping a cup of coffee, the answer came to him. Tom decided to give back. He had spent his whole life working quietly, but he had always noticed the people who struggled around him. People who, like him, were overlooked by the rest of the world. The janitors, the cleaners, the maintenance workers. The ones who kept everything running behind the scenes, but were rarely acknowledged. He thought about them, and how much a little extra could mean to people who had so little. With this in mind, Tom made a decision. He would donate a portion of his earnings to a local charity that helped underprivileged workers. The charity provided support for those who often fell through the cracks, helping with housing, health care, and education for their families. It was a cause close to his heart because, not too long ago, he had been one of those people struggling to make ends meet with no safety net in place. On the day he handed the donation check to the charity director, Tom felt something he hadn't expected, a deep, overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He realized that the money Mrs. Lillian had given him wasn't just a reward for his loyalty and service. It was an opportunity to make a real difference. It wasn't about having more. It was about doing more. In addition to his charitable giving, Tom also used some of his newfound wealth to help his family. His younger sister had been struggling to pay off medical bills for years, and though she never asked for help, Tom knew she needed it. Without telling her, he paid off her debts in full. When she called him, her voice shaking with gratitude and disbelief, Tom simply smiled and said, "It's the least I could do." As the weeks passed, Tom began to settle into his new life. He still went to work every day, but now in his role as the company's integrity officer. His duties had changed, but his heart remained the same. He was still the same Tom, humble, quiet, and focused on doing what was right. But now he had the security to enjoy his life without the constant worry of what might go wrong. One evening, as he sat on his porch, Tom allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about his past, about the years he had spent as a janitor, working late into the night, unnoticed and unappreciated. He thought about how easy it would have been to become bitter, to feel that life had passed him by. But instead, he had chosen to be content with what he had. He had chosen honesty and hard work, even when no one was looking. And now, here he was, rewarded for those very qualities. He smiled softly to himself. It wasn't the money or the promotion that filled him with pride. It was the knowledge that it had been his character, his integrity, that had brought him here. Mrs. Lillian had seen something in him that no one else had seen, and now he was living a life he never thought possible. For the first time, Tom allowed himself to enjoy the fruits of his labor without guilt. He understood that it was okay to accept rewards for hard work, to enjoy the comfort that came with success. His modest home, though newly repaired and improved, was still a reflection of who he was, simple, solid, and built on a foundation of integrity. Tom leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of peace settling over him. He had been given more than he had ever expected, and in return he had given back. And that, he realized, was the greatest reward of all. The company's main conference room had never looked quite like this. Rows of chairs were set up neatly, with a podium standing at the front, and sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The room buzzed with quiet chatter as employees from every department filed in, curious about the unusual gathering. Some of them glanced around, wondering why they had been invited to this particular event. For Tom, standing in the back of the room, the scene felt surreal. He had never imagined himself at the center of attention in a room like this, certainly not for a ceremony in his honor. He adjusted his collar nervously and tugged at the cuffs of the new shirt he had bought just for today. It felt strange, being dressed up like this. After years of wearing the same janitor's uniform, stepping into this new role still didn't feel quite real. Up at the podium, Mrs. Lillian stood poised and calm as always. Her presence commanded respect. But today, there was a different tone in the air, one of warmth and celebration. Tom watched as she smiled and chatted with a few employees before turning her attention to the crowd. She looked directly at him for a brief moment, and he felt a strange mixture of pride and discomfort well up inside. He still wasn't sure why Mrs. Lillian had insisted on holding this ceremony. After all, he was just doing his job, same as he always had. Sure, the title had changed, and his responsibilities had grown, but to him, he was still the same Tom, the guy who cleaned up after everyone. Being celebrated for that. It felt strange. But today wasn't just about his title or promotion. It was about something deeper, something Mrs. Lillian had recognized in him from the start. His character, his integrity, and his unwavering loyalty. As the room quieted, Mrs. Lillian stepped up to the podium, her smile warm but professional. "Thank you all for joining us today," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Today, we're here to honor someone who has long been a part of this company, but whose contributions have often gone unnoticed." Tom shifted uncomfortably, feeling the eyes of the entire room on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he resisted the urge to shrink back and disappear into the shadows where he had spent most of his working life. Mrs. Lillian continued, her words steady and deliberate. "Many of you know Tom as the janitor who quietly went about his work, day after day, without complaint. What you may not know is that Tom has been one of the most observant, honest, and dedicated individuals I've had the privilege of working with." She paused, and the room remained silent, all eyes now searching for Tom. He could feel his face heating up as people finally realized who she was talking about. The janitor, the man who had been nearly invisible for years, was now at the center of their attention. "A few weeks ago," Mrs. Lillian went on, "Tom did something remarkable. He saw something that many of us missed, something that could have jeopardized this company. And instead of staying quiet, he spoke up. He acted with integrity and honesty, and because of that, he saved us from making a grave mistake." The employees in the room murmured in quiet surprise. Tom had always been the janitor, someone most people walked past without a second thought. Now, to hear that he had been instrumental in protecting the company from a major crisis, it was a revelation. Tom shifted awkwardly on his feet, his gaze dropping to the floor. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and he certainly wasn't used to being praised for something that, in his mind, was just common sense. But as Mrs. Lillian spoke, he realized that this wasn't just about his actions. It was about the values he had lived by every day, values that were now being celebrated. Today, Mrs. Lillian continued, we're not just recognizing Tom for one moment of bravery. We're recognizing him for the years of quiet dedication, the honesty, and the humility he's shown throughout his time here. And because of that, I'm proud to announce that Tom has been promoted to a new role as our company's integrity officer, a role specifically created for him because of who he is. The applause started slow, almost hesitant, as if the employees weren't quite sure how to react. But then, it grew louder, spreading through the room until it became a full round of applause. People turned in their chairs to look at Tom, some of them nodding in approval, others smiling warmly at him. The respect in their eyes was palpable. Tom, still standing at the back, felt a rush of emotions. He wasn't used to applause, at least not directed at him. He had spent his life in the background, cleaning up after everyone else, unnoticed and unremarkable. But today, that was changing. For the first time, people were seeing him for more than just the janitor. They were seeing him for who he really was, someone who had always done his best, even when no one was watching. Mrs. Lillian beckoned him to the front, and Tom reluctantly made his way through the crowd. He could feel the eyes on him. But this time, it didn't feel so bad. There was a quiet warmth in the room, a sense of genuine respect that he had never experienced before. As he stood beside Mrs. Lillian, she extended her hand. Tom, on behalf of everyone here, thank you. Your integrity is an example to us all. Tom hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand, still feeling the weight of the moment. I'm not one for speeches, he said softly, his voice barely above a murmur. A few people in the crowd chuckled, and Tom relaxed just a little. I don't really know what to say except, thank you. I never expected anything like this. I just did what felt right. The crowd applauded again, this time with a sense of warmth and camaraderie. Tom glanced around, catching the eyes of some of the people he had worked alongside for years, people who had never given him a second thought. Now those same people were smiling at him, nodding in recognition. They didn't see him as just the janitor anymore. They saw him as someone who had made a difference. As the ceremony concluded, employees began to approach Tom, offering their congratulations. Some of them shook his hand, others patted him on the back, and a few even apologized for not noticing him sooner. Tom accepted their words with grace, though he still felt a little uncomfortable with all the attention. Thanks, he would say quietly, offering a small smile. I just did